Everyone. I'm Heather Pierucki. I play lots of roles in my life, but today I am a licensed mental health counselor on Oahu. I run an agency called ChangeWorks Hawaii. We focus on creating impactful change in our community. The majority of the time, that is people coming to us saying, "Can you help us with XYZ?" and us determining if our team is the right fit to help with that particular program, solution, quandary, whatever it is. But we are a team of mental health professionals. We do everything from individual practice all the way through that bigger kind of macro social work style. So we do program development, we do clinical supervision, we consult on cases. It's never a dull moment in our little agency. So today we're talking about trauma informed care. If you have any troubles with slides or you have questions or something doesn't make sense, please drop something in the chat or ping Ashley. She's here to help support me and support us, make sure everybody has a pleasant and educational time today. But essentially, we're doing some of the basics or trauma informed care 101. And when I started doing this training, it was many, many years ago when trauma informed care first became an overarching theme that we started to study and talk about. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, was the one that really kind of forefront trauma informed care and started to define some of the tenets. So in essence, it became like a substance abuse treatment framework because we found that many folks who dealt with substance use also dealt with trauma. And since then, it has expanded through many disasters that have happened both locally and throughout our world. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care, but we're also going to talk a little bit about resilience. One of my favorite quotes to come out of SAMHSA is, "One does not need to be a therapist to be therapeutic." Therapy is a very specific process, and we use that process in relationship with each other, and the therapist has to be licensed. But in order to create therapeutic support for someone, you don't have to be a licensed therapist. You can be a friend, you can be a family member, you can be a service worker, you can be a human being on the side of the street who offers to help. And so you don't need to be a licensed therapist to be able to provide support that's therapeutic. There's lots of definitions of what therapy looks like. And today we're going to sort of set our intentions around the therapeutic support of what we call trauma-informed care. So today we're going to talk a little bit about trauma. We're going to talk about how it impacts us. We're going to talk about some examples and what it looks like. We're also going to define trauma-informed care, why we use it, how we use it, what sort of the framework of it is, and the intention behind it. And then we're going to piggyback into some resilience talk, because most of the time we learn the tenets of something, but then it's confusing and we're not quite sure what to do with that. So we're going to do a little bit of practical application as well. No role play today. So for those of you that love role play, I am sorry, I did cut it out. But if you want to do role play, you can always send me an email. We can set up a time. Little disclaimer for you, talking about trauma is pretty heavy. There is a spectrum of how we experience trauma and what trauma looks like, but it can invoke these sort of unexpected reactions, especially now in light of what all of you are helping to support and manage on Maui with the wildfires. We've come out of this sort of idea of stabilization, the sort of immediacy of need, and now we're moving into what we call the recovery phase, right? Which will be very long and probably pretty arduous and full of misinformation and full of heartache and full of trauma. And so when we talk about these things, please feel free to take a break if you need to. You can turn your camera off, you can step away for a minute. We are only going for about 55 minutes. So if you want to kind of push through, you can, but you know yourself best. So please take a break if that's necessary for you. Couple reminders. I know all of you are lovely humans, but while we're together, please try to listen actively to the best of your ability in whatever headspace you're in today. If you're going to contribute, which you are welcome to, and I would ask that you interrupt me if you have a question or drop something in the chat. But, try to contribute positively. This is not an invitation for a overarching argument, rather just an exchanging of information. We're going to be respectful to each other. We all experience what we're experiencing differently. I, being an island removed, am experiencing Maui very differently than the folks who are living and breathing and existing on Maui. So we're all experiencing this differently. Totally okay to disagree. That's kind of what makes the world beautiful. And so, again, we're going to contribute positively and we're going to be respectful. Take a break if you need it. Totally, totally okay. So, what's trauma? Well, in essence, trauma is a lasting response. So, trauma can be an experience, but it also is this sort of lasting, mostly emotional response that results from us experiencing a distressing event. So, we don't categorize trauma in kind of funnels, but rather we categorize trauma as an experience because two people who experience the exact same event are likely not going to have the same residual effects from it. Doesn't have anything to do with anything other than the fact that we're human and our responses are different from each other's. There's no drama to it. There's no one is better than the other. It's just how we experience things. And so when we consider traumatic events and the experience of them, we want to make sure that we understand that trauma isn't just about the immediate event. It's also about how our sense of safety is impacted. What felt like a safe place yesterday may not feel like a safe place today. It impacts our sense of self. A person that we trusted who in some way traumatized us or was involved in traumatizing us all of a sudden becomes a person who isn't safe anymore. And in the longer runs, yes, in immediacy, but in the longer runs, it also really impacts our ability to kind of self regulate. And for those of you that aren't familiar, self regulation means understanding our emotions and navigating them. So when we feel sad, what do we do with that sadness? Well, some of us do things that are not as healthy with our sadness than we could. So when we experience trauma, it isn't just the event, it's also these long-standing responses that result from experiencing and living through a distressing event. So it does affect our mental capacities, it affects our ability to learn, so our educational capacities, it affects us psychologically, and much like the picture on the slide, it becomes a very heavy burden to carry when we aren't able to process through it and find the support that we need. When we talk about trauma, we break it into three kind of basic elements. You have the event. The event can be a physical experience. So we think about physical abuse as traumatic. It can be a verbal experience. So if you think about it, one fight with another person can result in long-standing emotional impact. It doesn't mean that you aren't going to be able to do your day to day, but it does mean that that relationship has changed. So you can have a verbal event that's a one-off, or you can have a verbal event that's perpetual. So I think about caregivers who are unable to care for their children and remind children of that. I think about bosses who are unable to manage their own emotional regulation, and so they take it out on their staff. I think about domestic violence relationships in which the verbal abuse is long standing and long winded and happens over time. You can also have spiritual trauma. I won't get into the specifics of that, but if you have questions or you want to talk about that, please send me an email. The thing with traumatic events is that you can have trauma both in the threat of an event and also the actual event. So your traumatic experience with the Maui wildfires started when you first heard about it, even if you couldn't see it or smell it or feel it. And when we talk about trauma, it isn't just the events, it's everything that surrounds the events as well. And then events can be single or they can be repeated over time. Then we want to talk about the experience of trauma. So when something happens to or around us, we experience it in a way that's unique to us as human beings. When you're a child, you experience trauma differently than when you're a young adult. When you're a young adult, you experience trauma that's different from when you're an adult. It doesn't mean that we're more or less capable or more or less resilient. It just means that the experience is unique to us. And how we label and assign meaning to our experiences does help either push our progress forward or halt our process. So when we say something is traumatic and that traumatic event has impacted us to every breadth of our being, that is going to impact how we manage the effects of that trauma. The experience of a traumatic event also is in identifying our risk factors of those. So we think about natural disasters. Folks who live in flood zones are going to experience trauma differently because they're going to exist at kind of a heightened emotional state worried and wondering if something is going to happen, as opposed to folks who don't live in a flood zone feeling pretty safe from floodwaters. And then we talk about the effects of trauma. So this is long lasting. It'll feel dormant for a long time, and then something will pop up and you'll be reminded of your traumatic experience. So you can have immediate responses and immediate effects to a traumatic experience, but you can also not feel it for 20 years. And then through a relationship, let's say you go see a therapist because you're experiencing some stress at work, and all of a sudden it comes forth that when you were a child, something happened. And we call that delayed onset. So maybe it kind of settled under the surface for a while, but then something happened and it kind of triggered you right back into experiencing that trauma. Trauma can be short, it can also be long. So when we consider something like the Maui wildfires, we want to consider both the actual impact of the experience, but we also want to talk about the duration of the care for the folks who were immediately impacted and secondarily impacted as well. We also have both visible effects and invisible effects. When we talk about things like abuse, we want to talk about both bruises as well as feelings. So we can't see our feelings. Often we can see the effects of our feelings, but we can't see how we feel. And so there are visible evidences, but there are also things that happen internally or externally that we don't see as well. Just to make sure that you guys get an idea of the broad spectrum of things that can be traumatic for folks, here is a non exhaustive, but pretty comprehensive list of things that can lead to not only experiencing a trauma, but also having long lasting traumatic effects from. So these are things like discrimination. Discrimination is not a one off thing. You can't just apologize for discriminating against someone and have that go away. There are healing things that happen or that need to happen in order to process through that trauma. And that trauma never goes away completely. We can heal from it and we can process through it and we can find ways to live alongside it, but the traumatic experience never goes away. We think about big things that happen globally, like war, terrorism, longstanding violence. We think about global pandemics such as the COVID pandemic that we have been living through for quite some time. And then we also can talk about things like historical trauma. Just a little note for those of you that have heard of a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Essentially, what Bessel van der Kolk did was a long-term study on folks that were having traumatic effects. So they were experiencing the results of trauma, but hadn't experienced trauma. He found that we can actually carry generational trauma through our DNA, through our bloodline. So if generations back somebody experienced a traumatic event, we can sometimes have the after effects of that. Disconnecting from our culture, disconnecting from our language, disconnecting from our cultural identities or our human identities. Those are all things that can really result in the long-term impacts of trauma. Any questions or anything you want to add to that list? Again, you're welcome to interrupt me or drop in the chat if you have additional things that you want to add. So for those of you that haven't heard of Gabor Mate, he is a incredibly wise and wonderful trauma therapist. He has written several books.
Sorry, Heather.
Please.
Sorry, I think Anthea had something to say.
Oh, please.
Or to comment.
I just wanted to know what the disconnection from the language, identity, and culture might look like.
It's a tricky one because it can look like lots of things. So this can be, for example, a child who is uprooted from where they live and where they grew up until they say the age of 6, moved into a place where, let's say, their language of origin. So let's say they speak Spanish and they move to a school that only speaks English. The disconnect from the identity that's held in that language can be super disruptive and may not show up until much later when we're having, kind of identity complications as we become adults, or figuring out why we don't get along with certain people. And it's because when we were a child, the identity that we felt connected to, we now are disconnected from because there isn't an opportunity for us to speak that language. There isn't encouragement to speak that language, things like that. That's one of the easier examples I can give. But it's usually when something like is as a result of like uprooting.
Thank you. That's perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it. So Gabor Mate has written several books on trauma. They're all wonderful. They're all very heady. So keep in mind, if you're going to read them, give yourself some time and some patience to be able to absorb the things that he is talking about. But he defines trauma as not what happens to you. So he really believes that the powerfulness of the trauma is not the actual incident or the event, but rather what happens inside of you as a result of that event. And so it isn't diminishing the traumatic experience, but rather highlighting what happens to our internal systems as a result of what it is. This is why we talk about long-standing traumatic events and experiences, because we often don't realize the incredible impacts of things until we're developing our identity, till we're starting jobs, till we're starting families, till we're having children, till we're moving places. And so our trauma can sometimes show up as confusion, right? Like, why do I feel this way? Or why am I feeling nervous? Why am I feeling scared? And sometimes it's because of things like Anthea, the disconnect from things that are comfortable for us, or the event didn't seem impactful at the time, but many years later kind of shows its colors. The impacts of trauma are pretty vast, and I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but by the way, I did upload the slides into your guys's conference thing. So if you want to access them, please feel free. The the impacts of trauma are pretty vast, and they do range from kind of the individual impacts, such as symptomatic behavior, mental illness, sometimes substance use, sometimes difficulty processing emotion or physical health, all the way into kind of organizational trauma. So this is things like your, I'm going to pick on executive directors, but your executive director just spontaneously leaves the agency, but doesn't leave anybody in charge, doesn't leave any guidance, just has to spontaneously leave. And that can result in folks like not knowing what to do, like who's in charge, who's making decisions, how do we order stuff? Like, what do I do when somebody has to sign off on something? Like, and that can sometimes result in employees being absent. It can sometimes result in us avoiding tasks that we're supposed to do. However, when we experience trauma individually, it can also have its impact on our organization because of what we're dealing with or not dealing with, right? So when we experience trauma as an individual, it can lead into us engaging in those sorts of behavior, excessive conflict with each other, loss of motivation in our work, avoiding things. In addition, our experience of trauma, both independently and collectively, can result in things like community poverty. We're dealing with a lot of inadequate housing, and a lot of things are being highlighted right now on Maui that maybe we could have looked at earlier. And so trauma has the ability to really shake us all the way to our core, and it often will highlight things that maybe we haven't managed or haven't dealt with in the past. So folks who experience trauma are more likely to smoke, they're more likely to have chronic disorders and diseases. They are more likely to have either passively or actively thought about suicide. They're more likely to engage in illicit substance use, and they're much more likely, 7 times actually scares me, but they're much more likely to not only have access to, but use alcohol as a way to cope or a mechanism to cope with either how we feel or how we don't want to feel. I'm only going to touch on this a little bit because I could probably do a whole presentation on secondary trauma. But for those of you that have studied trauma before, this is also called vicarious trauma. We're coming away from using the word vicarious. Not going to get into the why of it. Some of it is just semantics. But when we talk about secondary trauma responses, this is indirect exposure. So for those of us that are service providers who work with folks who are in difficult situations, we experience secondary trauma from our clients' traumatic experiences. So, as a therapist, when someone shares with me about their trauma, there is a boundary that has to be put up so that I don't actually absorb their traumatic experience. It obviously comes with practice, it comes with doing a lot of work outside of therapy to be able to, I don't like the word compartmentalize, but be able to compartmentalize the experience of hearing someone else's trauma. But I think about folks that work for CWS, think about folks that work in reunification. We're exposed to trauma all the time. For those of us that work with socioeconomic statuses that struggle, we're exposed to trauma every day. These are folks that can't get enough food to eat. These are folks that don't have appropriate drinking water. These are folks that don't have housing. And so we tend to be impacted and affected by the challenges of the folks that we work with. And those two questions that we want to make sure, absolutely, you can get the infographic. I'll make sure I go back and tell you how to access the slides. What we want to make sure is ask these two questions, right? So, am I at risk? Like in the population that I work with, am I at risk? When I first moved to Hawaii 10 years ago, I started as a clinical supervisor at a residential treatment facility called Koilani. Focuses on working with folks who are dually diagnosed with both substance use disorders and mental illness, often have co-occurring houselessness as well. But in my role, one of the incredible privileges I had was being able to meet with folks and talk about what got them there, what their life was like, what their family was like, where they have been, where they want to go. And when you listen to that all day long and every day of every week and over time, there is an understanding of the exposure to that risk being impactful for me. So at the end of the week, we often did kind of a staff check-in where it's like, what was the toughest thing that we had to hear about this week? What was the biggest struggle that one of our residents shared with us? And we would process through that together so that we could leave that experience of secondary trauma at the facility, go home, rest, make sure that we're engaging in our own care of the self. And it's really about understanding not only that it happens, but it also can be something that happens without us really noticing if we're not careful. So ask yourself, am I at risk for secondary trauma? And then how do I check in with myself to make sure that I'm understanding whether or not I'm impacted and affected by it? So when we talk about trauma-informed care, we want to make sure that we focus on the fact that trauma-informed care is a strengths-based framework. So what this means essentially is we focus on the things that are going well. We focus on the things that people are doing well. We focus on the things that create strength in folks, understanding that the impact of trauma can influence us in so many ways, physically, psychologically, emotionally. And so when we talk about using this framework, we want to make sure that we're coming from a perspective that focuses on the strengths of our folks in response to the trauma that they experience. So what we're doing is when we understand that and we come from a place of strength, we're then going to help sort of rebuild a sense of control. Because trauma often makes us feel like we're out of control. We don't understand the emotions that we're feeling. We don't understand the experiences that we're having. And we lose that sense of empowerment or that sense of power over our experiences. So trauma-informed care comes from a strengths-based framework, which is quite difficult to say. So here's how we look at trauma-informed care from kind of a global perspective and a strengths-based perspective. We first want to start with, instead of asking, what's wrong with you? You got an attitude, what's wrong with you? You're quiet today, what's wrong with you? You're not engaging with me socially, what's wrong with you? We want to take that question, we want to flip it to, hey, you're kind of quiet today. Did something happen? Do you want to talk about it? Hey, whoa, you're raising your voice to me. What happened? What's going on? So we're going to flip from that sort of accusatory, what's wrong with you, to that curiosity, right? So what happened? Everything okay? And then we're going to try and come from a place of understanding that trauma doesn't always make sense to us. How someone else is experiencing their traumatic event isn't necessarily going to resonate with us and isn't necessarily going to make sense to us. So understanding that when we come from that place of curiosity, we understand that the impact of trauma affects people both physically, emotionally, and in our mental health, as well as our spiritual health, as well as our connectedness health, right? So our ability to connect with other people to find support. It also has a significant impact on how we engage in services. So as case managers, as family support workers, as folks who go out and do outreach, sometimes lack of engagement doesn't mean folks don't want to connect with you. It simply means that they can't add one more thing to their plate. And we learned this a lot when I worked on the Hawaii Pathways Project, which was a housing first program on Oahu that really aimed to absolutely meet people where they are. So we went on outreach every day. We connected with folks and basically took them from the street and moved them into an apartment as seamlessly as possible. There were some days when my folks just couldn't engage with me. It was just too much, too hard. And even the idea of getting support was tricky. So when people would no show or not show for their appointments, took a lot of us a long time to recognize that rather than using that as an opportunity to punish folks or say like, oh, you didn't meet with me, so sorry, I can't help you, to a place of, hey, I missed you the other day. What happened? Everything okay? Something I can help with? And in doing so, we then avoid what we call re traumatization in our systems. So rather than punishing folks for not engaging, we try to understand where they're coming from and give them opportunities to help us meet them where they are. Any questions on that or thoughts on that? Sometimes that can be kind of a mind flip. Okay. So trauma informed care comes from these kind of six main principles. And we do have a slide for each of them. So no worry about taking notes if you don't want to, but they do kind of, we go into a detail a little bit. But the six main principles, and they've evolved over time. So it used to be four, now it's six. The first one and the primary one, and the one that we should always consider first, is safety. We want to make sure that, for those of you that understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs or use that, we want to understand food, shelter, and water, right? The most basic of things that help us feel safe. A door to lock at the end of the day, often a bed to sleep in and not a floor to sleep on, not a ground to sleep on, not a tent to sleep in. So we want to focus first on safety. Like, is it safe for our folks to be where they are? The second, I would argue, kind of equally important to safety is this idea of trustworthiness and transparency. Like, do people count on us? Can they count on us? Are we showing up for them? Third is implementing some sort of peer support. So engaging folks in relationships with each other so that they can support each other because of their experiences, right? Because they've both experienced houselessness, because they've both experienced substance use, because they've both experienced physical or emotional abuse. How do we connect folks to each other so that they can not only learn from each other, but provide support to each other? Moving into collaboration and mutuality, like, how do we make sure that we're giving off the same message all the time? So, how do we make sure all workers are coming from relatively the same page, using your own beautiful and wonderful uniqueness, but doing that in kind of the same direction? Fifthly, how we empower our folks to have a voice. So, people who have been historically silenced, how do we empower them to be able to talk about what they need, to be able to talk about what they want, to be able to talk about what they love? And then lastly, and serves as an umbrella, this idea of how do we honor our cultural, historical, gender, heritage issues? How do we allow people to be exactly who they are, wherever they are, however they are, without judgment, without reproach? So I'm going to dive a little bit into each of these. I don't want to take up all of your guys' time talking about just these, but we're going to start with culture. One, because it's not more important than safety, but this one definitely sparks conversation more than the others. So when we engaged in a trauma-informed care response, the very first thing, aside from safety, is, what do I need to understand about the culture that I'm working with? What are the things that I need to know? What's the historical racism? What's the historical cultural appropriations? What are the historical experiences of this group of folks? And what do I need to be extra sensitive to? And then once you know that, how do we offer access to support in an appropriate way? The number one way, just as a spoiler, is to ask people, right? What do you need me to honor? What do you need me to know about you and your day to day? What helps me be a support to you? Sometimes folks don't know, right? Like, sometimes they can't answer that question because they're not sure. But us asking that and coming from a place of curiosity really does help folks feel like they can trust us to come from a place of understanding and support, as opposed to doing what we think is best because we think it's best for them. We got to understand what people need from their own perspective. And then When we talk about oppression, or we work with groups of folks who have experienced historical oppression and currently experience oppression, it's even more important for us to come from that place of curiosity. So the question at the bottom of this slide is really inspired to like make you think about, like, are we honoring culture without putting our own cultural assumptions into our interactions? It doesn't mean that you have to tiptoe. It does mean that you need to shift from, I think you should do this, to help me understand how we can make this as supportive for you as possible. And sometimes it can feel tedious, right? Because we're taking more time to understand. But when you honor culture, you come from a principle and a place of being the most trauma informed that you possibly can, and give people a space to be able to express what they need. Secondarily, safety is defined by who we serve. So, what I consider safe is not necessarily what other folks consider safe. When we talk about safety, we're not just talking about our physical presence or our environmental presence. In Housing First, we focused mostly on actual housing, right? So, taking folks from a place not meant for human habitation and moving them into a place that had a door that could lock, where they could feel safe, where they could finally exhale an entire breath, where they could take a full breath in without worrying about what might happen at the end of the day. When we talk about things like child welfare, this is considering both the ramifications of removing someone from a physically abusive situation, but also understanding the impacts of what that does psychologically, depending on the age of the child. And so when we talk about supporting a safe space or creating a safe space, we do try to default as much to the person that we're working with as possible. And then understand that each interaction that we have, let's say we had an interaction that was less psychologically safe, something where we maybe were removing a child, or something where we had to end something early because something happened that shouldn't have happened. Each interaction is an opportunity to recover from those things and to provide a compassionate and non-intrusive opportunity to connect with your client again. So understanding trauma, but also becoming predictable and becoming reliable and becoming consistent helps to create some of that safety and comfort, even if you don't have all the answers and even if you can't solve all the challenges. So in your trauma informed care work, ask yourself, what does it look like for us to help support safe spaces or participate in the support of that? You don't have to have all the answers. Having all the answers will lead you into burnout and likely job change. So we want to make sure that we're having really realistic expectations of what creating a safe space looks like. Even if the safe space is only an hour a week, you're still creating a safe space. So leading into that and understanding that reliability is one of the important foundations of connection, we want to make sure that we're transparent with folks. Like, don't tell folks that you can do something if you can't do it. Like, don't make a promise that you know you're not going to keep. Have really clear expectations of your role and who you are and what kind of power you have. That's how we build trust with folks. I remember doing outreach along the Kapalama Canal and knowing that we didn't have 40 apartments for the 40 folks that slept along the canal. Like, I couldn't promise housing to 40 people. So I didn't, even though it sucked. It was horrible to have to tell people that I didn't have a guaranteed apartment for them. But if I was honest about what I could do and what the team could do, it at least created an opportunity for me to connect with people so that when that opportunity did come up, we could communicate and trust each other and make it happen. So when you think about coming from a trauma-informed care place, we want to make sure we understand, like, how do I build trust with folks? Like, how do I display honesty? How do I set clear expectations? And what does that look like based on, kind of my personality? As we move into relationships that are established, then how do we use each other, right? How do we use the agency? How do we use the community? How do we collaborate and partner with folks that do things that complement our work? When we come from a trauma-informed care perspective, connection is key. One of the most healing principles in processing through trauma is connecting with someone, usually a mental health professional, but connecting with someone that you can trust. So when we work together to partner to create safety, we're also partnering to create collaboration because we don't have to do everything all the time. So if we are able to create some of those boundaries around focusing on the things that we can control or the things that our agency can do or the things that we are able to provide for people, it will help with that feeling of fulfillment on both sides of the relationship. So you'll have people that are not only happy and engaged in a relationship with you, but you'll have people that are starting to trust your partners as well that also support you. So when you're thinking about trust and you're thinking about working together, it's not just working with your clients, but also working with each other. Okay, peer support. This one's tricky because a lot of us come from a place of confidentiality, right? We want to really respect and honor what our folks are going through. We don't just want to arbitrarily share stories. But in our conversations with folks that we're supporting, we want to try to intentionally create opportunities to connect with each other that have shared experiences. So, right now, this is happening a lot on Maui. People are banding together and they're just doing the thing, whatever the thing is, whether it's supplies or transport or driving people back and forth or supporting while folks are going back into Lahaina. This is an opportunity for folks who have experienced something similar to be able to connect and then engage in opportunities to talk with each other and to provide spaces for each other. Peer support will create a layer that service support can't necessarily replicate. Service providers are incredibly important. There's nothing diminishing that. But when people connect and mutually help each other to establish hope, it's very powerful. So as you're engaging in trauma-informed care, look at what does it look like for me to help folks intentionally connect with each other? Maybe that's groups. Maybe that's having an hour of free playtime. Maybe that's families meeting in a park, things like that, where we are creating space to be able to help people and facilitate folks connecting with each other. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're providing opportunities for folks to feel empowered. Trauma removes most of our control. And when we experience a traumatic event that has long-term consequences, most of our choice and empowerment goes right out the window. It all gets taken from us. We no longer have a safe place to return home to. We no longer have the folks in our lives that were safe places for us. And so when the trauma occurs, we manage the crisis stuff and the stabilization stuff. But as we move into those recovery times, we realize that we don't have that many choices. We're at the mercy of other people's decision making. And so if we come from that place of transparency about what we're able to provide, and we come from that place of curiosity about what people are looking for, we can then build on the strengths of our community and build on the connections of lived experience to be able to provide what we can where we can, which then allows people to voice their choices and voice their concerns. And then from that, we move into resilience. And resilience is that special talent to be able to say, this is really hard, but I'm going to do it for one more day. This is really hard, but I'm going to do it for one more hour. And early on in my career, when I was seeing a lot of people who had experienced trauma kind of one after the other in my practice, I would go to like the second to last or the last house. I did community-based therapy. I would go to the second or last house, and I would sit in my car right before I went in, and I would say, one more, and then I can go home and breathe. Because holding space for folks is really, really powerful, but it's also very, very taxing. And so when we inspire folks to be able to make choices, as small as those choices may be, we are teaching and guiding through what we call self-advocacy. So folks' ability to be able to feel like they can make their own choices, but also take those steps to be able to become resilient to them. So as you think about the kind of 6 principles, they all flow into each other, but they also kind of ebb and flow in order. So when we create safety and we honor cultural identity and cultural experiences, then all the other 4 kind of tie in different ways. So empowerment creates choice, transparency creates trust, and so then we lead into the creation of resilience. And resilience is very powerful, but it takes a long time for folks to develop that. And there are times when we're going to fall apart in the middle of our resilience. So trauma-informed care and SAMHSA took it one step further and created the 4 Rs. Because we're talking about resilience, they wanted to make sure that it all translated with the letter R. So the first, and I would encourage you to maybe not memorize these, but I would encourage you to kind of go through these and look at what R you struggle with the most so that you can understand where you might need to kind of push on that pressure point of learning and understanding. But the first is realization. Everybody at any level in their lives needs to have a basic realization of what trauma is and how it can affect people, whether that's independently, whether that's in communities, whether that's in families. So the first is realize that trauma exists and that we can look for it. The second is to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. This tends to be the one that I'm the most sensitive about because any behavior, any symptom, any word, any accounting of a story can be a sign of a traumatic experience. So in therapy, I'm often very sensitive to, oof, they shifted body language. Oof, they missed eye contact. And that starts to tell me, there's something else going on there. And so make a little mental note. And as you start to recognize those things, then you respond, right? And not all responses are your responsibility as a service provider. The responses are layered, right? So you need individual support, but you also need response of programs. Programs have to band together and provide support for their direct staff as well as for the folks that they serve. And then agencies have to do that, right? So not only is it all hands on deck, but it's also all hands understanding when folks need to take a step back, right? When people need a break. And then communities come together, right? And they respond to trauma with a trauma-informed approach. And then people start to feel safe. They start to feel like they can be honest about what they need. And then things like national and global come into play. This is, organizations like FEMA that come in and with the best of intentions want to provide, but also need to be taught, right? Cultural significance, what it looks like to be transparent, how our communities work, things like that. So we're realizing trauma, we're recognizing what it looks like in folks, we're creating responses, and then we're moving into proactivity, which is resisting re-traumatization. So doing everything in our power to not re-traumatize folks or reintroduce trauma to folks who are already traumatized. This is things like forcing people to talk about their experience. Some folks are just not ready to do that. Some folks are never going to be ready to do that. But if we allow people to be who they are, where they are, we will help to resist the re-traumatization of their experiences. Any questions on this slide? Great. I just realized we don't have a ton of time left. If you have questions, please drop them in so that I can try to answer them. The next 2 slides are talking about resilience. We're going to talk about resilience in working with our folks, and then we're going to talk about resilience in ourselves. So I might go a little bit quickly. We've talked about some of these things already when you're doing your work, your outward work, and then we'll talk a little bit about your inward work too. Again, I could do a whole series on how we take care of ourselves. So stay tuned. Maybe there'll be a part 2. Developing resilience in our folks is things like meeting very basic needs. Rather than trying to solve all the problems of today, let's sit down and let's have a soda. Let's drink a bottle of water together. Let's talk about what we're trying to accomplish. Create some basic conversation to be able to invite trust and transparency. When you're doing that, be curious about folks' cultural experiences, their historical trauma, what they've experienced as a child, as an adult, and observe that. Watch for shifts in body language, watch for folks who are avoiding the answers to questions. And then before you start talking to someone or before you start trying to solve problems, ask if they want help. Do you want a solution or would you like me to just sit with you? Because maybe you don't want me to have the answer. Maybe you just want to have a little bit of connectedness. And when you speak with folks, speak calmly. Do it with kindness and do it intentionally to provide space and not to provide status or provide a solution or provide updates. Maybe folks just want to be able to sit and breathe for a minute and drink a glass of water. When we listen to understand what folks are going through rather than listening to have the answer or the response. This is something that a lot of us struggle with because we want to make things better. We want to make people feel better. So we think by having all the answers in the world and all the solutions in the world, we're going to make everything better. But really, sometimes folks just want us to listen to their experiences. Resilience in yourself. So I definitely don't have enough time to talk ad nauseum about this, but when you're developing resilience in yourself, it starts with really taking a step back and understanding your own experiences and understanding what's happening with you. I know that I'm starting to break down when I get snappy with my friends. I don't have a whole lot left. I start to snap. I'm not normally a snappy person, but that's what it looks like when I'm starting to move towards things like compassion fatigue or move towards things like overworking. I have to understand my own experiences so that I can then engage in the practices that help to build me into being my best version of myself. Not better, but my best version of myself. And so when I recognize my natural reactions like snapping versus patience and kindness, that tells me when I need to take a step back from things. Even the most powerful, involved, important people have to take time away from their day to day. So please don't think you're an exception to that rule. Everybody needs to be able to step back and take a breath. Everybody has limits. So when you start to think about, wow, I'm kind of snappy, I'm kind of impatient, ooh, what's going on with me? Try to be honest with yourself. Like, try to tell yourself, okay, I think I need a little bit of break. Maybe I need to engage in one of my self-care practices. Maybe I need to take a walk. Maybe I need to take a break. Maybe I need to cancel a meeting. It will vary based on what you need. And then if you hear nothing else for the rest of today, please pick one thing and please do that one thing. Don't do everything. Everything is impossible, but you can do one thing. Like I can take a 10-minute walk. I can stop and drink a glass of water. And all of those things will build as you do one thing at a time. Often we set ourselves up for feeling badly because we try to do everything 7 days a week. And it's just not going to happen. Last couple of things on our kids. So when we work with our kids who have experienced trauma, we need to definitely be aware of the children who, because of circumstances, are going to be more at risk. This is things like socioeconomic status. This is things like being far away from services. This is things like kids who don't go to school. These are things like kids who aren't engaging in any learning processes at all. Maybe it's not a formal school, but they're not being educated in any way. When you work with kids, sit at the level where they can see you and they feel connected to you. Don't stand over kids. When we support safety with children, it's supporting familiarity, supporting routine, it's supporting things that kids are used to doing and feel safe doing them. Yes, Toby, the slides are totally available for you to print. When we talk about how our kids are feeling, ask them how they're feeling in their body. Your tummy hurt? Your tummy feel nervous? Your tummy feel like it's doing jumping jacks? Instead of, are you feeling nervous? Because maybe they don't know what nervous means, but their heart is beating really fast. Oh my goodness, Miss Heather, my heart is racing. It's racing so fast like a jackrabbit. And when we ask about body sensations, kids can communicate to us how they're feeling, even if they don't know the words. Often our children's behavior is the way that they tell us how they're feeling. So when kids are what we would call kind of acting out or think kids are engaging in behaviors undesirable to us, it's often because they're trying to tell us something. They need connection. They need a glass of water. Maybe they need a nap. Any of those things. By the way, those also apply to human beings as adults. So sometimes you just need to put yourself to bed for 20 minutes, take a break. But with our kids, their behavior is kind of the first line of communication in them telling us how they're struggling or if they're struggling. Try to avoid punishment, try to respond with connectivity, and definitely find tools that are helpful for that child. So rather than trying to get them to use the tool that you're giving them, try to understand the tools that do work when you try them. Okay, here is your takeaway slide. Very proud of the slide because it actually all fits. So We're changing the question. Instead of what's wrong with you, we're asking, what happened? Would you like to tell me about that? We're understanding that trauma is not just the experience, it's also what happened inside as a result of what we experienced. We're using those 4 R's to recognize that folks deal with trauma, realizing that it's prevalent, responding with care and compassion, resisting re-traumatization. And we're using, oh yeah, there's 6. I thought for a minute there was only 5 principles down there, guys. It's like a hot minute. But we're using those 6 principles to help guide us in our care. Okay. Thoughts. I would love to hear your questions. I would love to hear your feedback. There's my email address if you would like to email me and tell me what you disagree with. Tell me what you want more information on. Okay, Corinne, thank you. I'll take a look at it.
I wanted to say something that I've noticed too, even when speaking with my child at home, like the way, like I know he doesn't understand what some of the words mean, and I catch myself telling it to him all the time. I'm like, son, why are you being so like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, I can't think of anything right now, but sometimes I'm like, when I'm talking to him, I'm just like, are you okay? Like, do you need a hug? And I notice it too at work when I'm dealing with my clients, the way that they're talking to their kids is like, can you stop being so extra? And I'm like, your son doesn't know what extra means. Like, so I really appreciate that whole little segment of that part.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I love that you highlighted that. I think having children and recognizing that helps remind us that sometimes it's easier to do simple things than it is to do complicated things, right? Like sometimes we just need to say like, I feel bad. I don't know why I feel bad, but I just feel bad. And so maybe I need to sit and drink a glass of water or sit and be left alone. But our kids tell us that through their behavior. And so I don't know, some of my kids know what extra means, but not all of them.
So I want to say thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. I just so happened to be at a barbecue, and this was right after August 8th. And the host's daughter was completely traumatized, and she's at this barbecue, and she literally ran for her life, and barely made it out. And in talking to her, you know, it's kind of like survivor guilt in a sense. And I just had this like, you know, it's okay, it's okay where you're at. And just kind of reassured her that what she was feeling right then is just as important as, everybody's got their own journey. Right. And she so much needed that because she felt guilty that, oh, I made it, and these other people didn't. And that sense of guilt is really quite kind of interesting. And just having them settle in terms of where they're feeling, being able to identify what they're feeling. And it's so important to be able to talk about it. So I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that you brought up survivor's guilt. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about that in the coming months because we have a lot of folks that are really trying to manage difficult feelings around being alive. And at its very simplest, validation is where the support comes in, right? Like it's okay to feel the way that you feel. Like we don't have to stop feeling some way because we're supposed to or not supposed to. So absolutely. And, I hope to put something together about survivor's guilt, but it's a complicated and tricky topic. And sometimes can't always be condensed onto, slides. So thank you for bringing that up. See you all later. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you.